She heard it from the staircase, not the murmur of conversation she might have expected at this hour, nor the clink of a glass set down on walnut, nor the careful tread of a servant finishing the last of the evening's duties. It was laughter. Low, unguarded, startled out of someone who had clearly not intended to produce it, the kind of sound a man makes when he's forgotten that anyone might hear. Edith Stratton stopped on the third step from the bottom, her hand resting on the banister, her candle tilting enough that a bead of wax slipped down the taper and hardened against her thumb. She did not move. She had been married to Hugh Stratton, the 5th Duke of Ravelston, for 2 years, 3 months, and 11 days, and in all that time she had never once heard him laugh. She had heard him speak, measured, correct, occasionally dry in a way that might have been wit if it had ever been followed by any change in expression. She had heard him address tenants with the studied courtesy of a man who understood obligation as architecture, something to be constructed and maintained, never felt. She had heard him instruct Collis, his steward, with a precision that left no room for improvisation. She had heard him say good morning to her across the breakfast table in exactly the same tone every day for 781 mornings, a tone so uniform it might have been produced by mechanism rather than mouth. But she had never heard this. This sound that came from somewhere lower than the chest and higher than the stomach, this thing that required, she now understood, the complete absence of self-consciousness. She descended the remaining steps in her stockinged feet, her slippers left beside the bed upstairs because she had only come down for the book she'd been reading before dinner. The corridor was dark except for the line of amber light beneath the library door, which stood slightly ajar, perhaps 3 inches, enough for the sound to travel, but not enough to see more than a sliver of firelit room beyond. She moved to the doorframe and looked through the gap. Hugh sat in the wing-back chair nearest the fire, which had burned down to a steady glow that lit his face from below and caught the gray that had begun to show at his temples. He was in shirt sleeves, his coat discarded over the arm of the second chair, his cravat loosened to a state she had never seen in daylight or company. One ankle was crossed over the opposite knee. His posture was the posture of a man who believed himself entirely alone. In his hands was a book she recognized instantly, though it took her a full breath to accept what she was seeing. It was small, leather-bound, the color of dark honey, with a brass clasp that did not lock because the mechanism had broken in the autumn of the previous year, and she had never had it repaired. It was her journal, not a diary. She had never kept a diary. Diaries recorded what happened, and what happened at Ravelston was so numbingly predictable that to record it would have been an act of self-punishment. What she kept was something else. Observations, fragments, small, precise opinions about the world she moved through, set down in handwriting that was better than her mother had ever managed, and worse than her father would have accepted. She wrote about the way Mrs. Arden arranged the flowers in the morning room with the ruthless efficiency of a general marshalling troops. She wrote about the vicar's wife, who smiled with such determined brightness at every parish supper that Edith had begun to suspect it was held in place by some internal scaffolding that might, one Sunday, collapse without warning. She wrote about the color of the sky over the south lawn in October, which was not gray and not blue, but something between the two that did not have a name and deserved one. She wrote about the sound rain made against the library windows at Ravelston, which was not the same sound rain made against the drawing-room windows, because the drawing-room faced east and the library faced west, and the wind came from the west, so the rain was always more insistent on the library glass, more urgent, as if it had something specific to say. She also wrote about Hugh, sparingly, and with the kind of accuracy that might have been mistaken for cruelty if anyone had ever read it. She wrote that he salted his food before tasting it, which she considered a failure of curiosity. She wrote that he held his pen as if it had personally offended him. She wrote that he read his correspondence standing up like a man preparing to leave, even when he had nowhere to go. She wrote that he was handsome in the way a well-maintained building was handsome, structurally sound, proportionally correct, and entirely without warmth. She had written that entry 6 months into their marriage, on a Tuesday in November, when the fire in her sitting room had gone out and she had not rung for it to be relit, because she preferred the cold to the prospect of conversation with anyone. Now she stood in the corridor and watched him read it. He turned a page. His mouth moved, not reading aloud, but shaping the edge of a word the way a person does when something strikes them as particularly well put. Then the laugh came again, quieter this time, almost a breath, and he shook his head once, slowly, and pressed his thumb against the margin of the page, as if marking something he intended to return to. Edith did not retreat. She considered it. She stood at the threshold of that decision for perhaps 5 seconds, her weight balanced between the foot that would carry her backward up the stairs and the foot that would carry her forward into the room, and she understood with a clarity that felt almost physical that whichever direction she chose would determine the shape of the next 2 years as certainly as the first 2 had been determined by silence. She pushed the door open. It swung wider than she'd intended, and the movement of air made the fire shift in the candle on the mantel gutter. Hugh looked up. The laugh died, but not quickly enough. She had seen the end of it, the way it left his face by degrees, the mouth settling first, then the eyes, then the lines around the eyes, until what remained was the composed expression she knew as well as her own reflection, but the journal was still open in his hands, and his thumb was still pressed against the margin, and there was no way to unmake the last 30 seconds. Neither of them spoke. The clock on the mantel measured out 7 seconds. Edith counted them. She had always counted things when she did not know what to say. It was a habit her father, Sir Aldous Price, had considered unhelpful, and her governess had considered rude, and she herself considered necessary because numbers did not require interpretation. "That is mine," she said. Hugh looked down at the journal as if noticing it for the first time, which was so transparently false that she might have laughed herself under different circumstances. "Yes," he said. "You are reading it." "Yes?" Another silence. The fire settled. Somewhere in the house, a door closed. Mrs. Arden making her final rounds, checking the locks, banking the kitchen fire, performing the rituals that marked the end of Ravelston's day with the same ceremony that marked its beginning. "How long?" Edith asked. Hugh closed the journal, but he did not set it down. His thumb remained between the pages, holding his place, which told her everything she needed to know about whether he intended to continue. "I found it 3 weeks ago," he said, "on the windowsill in the morning room. You had left it beneath the cushion, but the clasp is broken and the cover was visible." 3 weeks. 21 days of entries read without her knowledge. 21 days during which he had sat across from her at breakfast with his usual expression of polished neutrality and known exactly what she thought of the way he salted his food. "You might have returned it," she said. "I might have. You chose not to." He looked at her. Not the way he usually looked at her, the glancing assessment of a man confirming that everything was in order before moving on to the next item of business, but steadily, with an attention she had not known he possessed. "The entry about the rain," he said, "on the library windows." She waited. "You are right that it sounds different from the drawing room. I had not noticed until I read what you had written, and then I stood at both windows during the storm on Thursday and listened, and you are entirely correct. The library rain is more insistent. I do not know why I never heard it before." Edith did not move. She stood in the doorway in her stockinged feet with her candle burning low and her dressing gown tied at the waist and her hair loosened from its pins, and she felt something shift in the room that had nothing to do with the fire and everything to do with the fact that Hugh Stratton had just admitted to standing at a window in the rain, listening, because she had told him to. She had not told him to. She had written it in a private journal that she had never intended him to read. But the effect was the same, and she understood now, with a precision that would later find its way into the journal itself, that there were conversations that could only happen this way, through the written word, left where it might or might not be found, read by someone who might or might not have been ready to hear it. "The entry about your pen," she said, "the way you hold it." Something changed in his expression, not embarrassment exactly, something closer to recognition, the look of a man who has just been told something about himself that he suspected was true but had never heard confirmed. "You wrote that I hold it as if it has personally offended me." "You do. My father held his pen the same way. I learned from watching him write. He was not a warm man." It was the most he had ever told her about his father. In 2 years, the late Duke of Ravelston had been mentioned precisely 4 times, twice in relation to estate matters with Collis, once when a portrait was moved from the gallery to the upper corridor, and once when a tenant had used the phrase, "your father's way of doing things," and Hugh had changed the subject with the efficiency of a man closing a ledger. Edith entered the room. She crossed to the second chair, moved his coat to the small table beside it, and sat down. The fire was warm on her shins. The journal lay in his lap, his thumb still between the pages. "What were you laughing at?" she asked. He opened the journal to the page his thumb had held. "Your description of Lady Tremaine at the Midsummer Assembly." Edith knew the entry. She had written it in July of the previous year, after an evening she had endured with the particular patience reserved for events that could not be avoided. Lady Tremaine had spent the better part of 2 hours describing her eldest daughter's accomplishments in a tone that suggested she was reading aloud from a military dispatch, each skill deployed like a regiment, the pianoforte advancing from the left, the watercolors holding the center, the needlework flanking from the east. "You compared her to a woman trying to sell a horse at Tattersall's," Hugh said, listing the bloodline, the teeth, the temperament, circling the animal so the buyers could see it from every angle, and growing increasingly desperate when no one reached for their checkbook. He said it without smiling, but the edge of the laugh was still in his voice, buried under the composed surface like water running beneath ice. "She does rather present Miss Tremaine as livestock," Edith said. Hugh looked at her. "You write the way other people think, but have the sense not to say aloud. That's not a compliment. It is not intended as one. It is an observation. I find I have been living beside someone who observes the world with considerable precision and says none of it to me, and I am attempting to understand why." The question sat between them like a hand of cards laid face up on the table. Edith looked at the fire. The coals had shifted into a formation that reminded her of a map, ridges and valleys, bright borders between territories. "You have never asked," she said. The silence that followed was different from the silences that had come before it. Those had been the silences of two people who had run out of things to say, or who had never begun. This was the silence of a man hearing something he should have heard 2 years ago, and understanding for the first time that the failing was his. Hugh set the journal on the arm of his chair. "No," he said, "I have not." "I did not marry expecting conversation," Edith said. "My father made the match. You were suitable. I was suitable. The settlements were signed. I understood the terms. And the terms did not include laughter. The terms did not include being known." She said it simply, without accusation, the way she might have noted that the terms did not include a carriage of her own or a particular color for the morning-room walls. It was a fact. It had the weight of a fact and the temperature of one, cool, solid, unambiguous. Hugh stood. He crossed to the window and looked out at the darkness, though there was nothing to see beyond his own reflection and the faint suggestion of the south lawn under moonlight. His hands were clasped behind his back, which was the posture he adopted when he was thinking and did not wish to appear uncertain. She had noted this in the journal. She wondered if he had read that entry too. "My mother kept a journal," he said, still facing the window. "My father found it after she died. He read it in one evening and burned it the following morning. He told me it contained nothing of value." Edith said nothing. She understood now, not everything, but enough. Enough to know that the journal in Hugh's hands was not merely a book he had found on a windowsill, but something closer to a door he had not known how to open, and that the laughter she had heard from the staircase was the sound of a man discovering that the door had been unlocked the entire time. "I should like to return it to you," Hugh said, turning from the window, "and I should like something in return." He waited. "I should like you to tell me one thing each day that you have not told anyone else. It need not be important. It need not be profound, but it must be true, and it must be yours." Hugh studied her. In the firelight, with his cravat loosened and his coat removed, and the architecture of his composure showing its first visible cracks, he looked, she thought, like a building after a storm, still standing, but no longer pretending it had not been touched. "One thing," he said, "one thing." "Beginning when?" "Now." He returned to his chair. He sat. He picked up the journal and held it out to her, and when she took it, their fingers overlapped for a moment on the leather cover, and neither of them pulled away immediately. "My father did not burn my mother's journal because it contained nothing of value," he said. "He burned it because it contained everything of value, and he could not bear to keep it because he had never once asked her what she thought while she was alive." The fire cracked. A log split and sent a shower of sparks up the chimney. Edith held the journal against her chest and looked at her husband, and for the first time in 2 years of marriage, she saw him clearly. Not the structure, not the stonework, not the well-maintained facade, but the man behind it, who had inherited his father's way of holding a pen and his father's way of holding silence, and had only just begun to understand that inheritance was not destiny. "Thank you," she said. "That is today's. You shall have to wait until tomorrow for the next. I am a patient woman." "Yes," Hugh said, and the corner of his mouth moved in a way she had never seen before. Not quite a smile, but the place where a smile might begin if it were given enough time and enough room. "I have read your journal, I know." Edith climbed the stairs with the journal pressed against her ribs, the candle guttering in her other hand, and when she reached her room, she sat on the edge of the bed for a long time without undressing. The house settled around her, the particular sounds of Ravelstone at rest, the creak of old timbers adjusting to the cold, the distant clatter of the scullery maid banking the range for the night. She opened the journal to the entry about Hugh's pen. She read it again with different eyes, the way one rereads a letter after learning something about the sender that changes the weight of every word. He holds it as if it has personally offended him. She had meant it as a small, sharp cruelty, a private joke at the expense of a man who gave her nothing to work with. Now it read differently. Now it read like a woman describing an injury she had not recognized as one. She did not write a new entry that night. She could not find the right distance from the subject. Too close, and it would read as sentiment; too far, and it would read as the same cool cataloging she had been doing for 2 years. She set the journal on her nightstand, blew out the candle, and lay in the dark. And for the first time since her marriage, the silence in the house felt less like absence and more like the held breath before speech. The days that followed were not transformed. Ravelston did not suddenly become a house of laughter and warmth, because that was not how stone warmed, slowly, from the inside, the way a hearth heats a room not all at once but by degrees, the walls absorbing what the fire offers and holding it. The first evening after the library, Edith came down to dinner expecting something. She was not certain what. An acknowledgement, perhaps, a reference to what had passed between them, some indication that the previous night had altered the terms of their shared existence even marginally. Hugh was already seated when she arrived. He stood when she entered, as he always did, and waited until she had taken her chair before resuming his own, as he always did, and addressed a remark to Mrs. Arden about the pheasant, as he always did, with the same tone he might have used to discuss the weather or the condition of a fence. Edith ate her soup. She had made a study of eating soup in silence over the previous 2 years and had become, she believed, something of an authority on the subject. The trick was to eat at a pace that suggested neither hunger nor indifference, brisk enough to appear occupied, slow enough to appear at ease. She had perfected this. It was among the least useful skills she had ever acquired. After the second course, Hugh dismissed Mrs. Arden and the footman. Edith set down her fork. The dining room at Ravelston was paneled in oak that had darkened with 2 centuries of candlelight and cooking smoke. And in the evenings, when the candles were lit in the silver candelabra that stood at the center of the table, the wood seemed almost to breathe, expanding with warmth, contracting with shadow, alive in a way that the rest of the house was not. "The entry about the vicar's wife," Hugh said without preamble. Edith waited. "You wrote that Mrs. Hartigan smiles as though she is operating a piece of machinery, that the muscles are engaged but the operator has gone elsewhere." "I did. I sat beside her at the parish supper last month. I'd never noticed. You are correct. The smile arrives approximately half a second before the occasion demands it, as though she has rehearsed the timing but not the feeling." "She is unhappy," Edith said. "Yes, I expect she is." It was not much, a few sentences exchanged across a table that had hosted 1,000 similar meals. But it was the first time in their marriage that Hugh had spoken to her about a person rather than a circumstance, and Edith felt the difference the way one feels a change in the weather. Not through any single dramatic sign, but through a general shift in pressure, a new quality in the air. After dinner, they moved to the drawing room. Mrs. Arden brought the tea tray, 1 cup, as was customary, because the Duke did not take tea after dinner, and had not taken tea after dinner in the 14 years Mrs. Arden had known him. Hugh sat in his usual chair by the fire and opened the evening paper. Edith poured her tea and opened her book. The clock measured out the silence in its usual way, and for 20 minutes nothing was different from any other evening in 2 years of evenings. Then Hugh folded the paper, set it on the side table, and said, "I was afraid of the dark until I was 12. My father considered this a deficiency of character. He removed the candle from my room when I was 7, and each night I lay in the dark and counted the minutes until morning, because if I was counting, I was not thinking about what might be in the corners." Edith looked up from her book. Hugh was staring at the fire with an expression she might have mistaken for calm if she had not been watching closely. But she had been watching closely for 2 years, and she saw the tension in his jaw and the way his right hand gripped the arm of the chair, and she understood that this was costing him something. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once, stood, and left the room. It was not graceful. It was not the tender unfolding of two hearts reaching toward each other across a candle-lit room. It was a man dropping a stone into a well and walking away before he could hear it land. But it was the beginning, and Edith recognized beginnings. She had catalogued enough of them in her journal to know that they rarely looked the way one expected. The evenings continued. Each night after dinner, when the candles were lit and Mrs. Arden had withdrawn, Hugh told her one thing, that he disliked the portrait of his grandfather in the gallery because the eyes followed him in a way he found accusatory, that he could not eat plover's eggs without thinking of a governess who had forced them on him at the age of 6 and whom he had never forgiven, that the sound of the front door closing in winter reminded him of a particular afternoon when he was 9 and had hidden in the ice house because his father's voice had been louder than usual, and the ice house was the one place in the grounds where sound did not carry. That he had once, during his first session sitting in the House of Lords, looked around the chamber at the assembled peers and thought that every man present appeared to be performing a version of his father, and wondered whether the entire institution was simply a room full of men pretending to be the men who had come before them. Some evenings the offering was small, a childhood preference for the smell of beeswax, a dislike of the sound of gravel under carriage wheels. Other evenings it was large enough that the air in the room seemed to change shape around it. The night he told her that his mother had once, in a rare moment of candor, told him that she had married his father, believing that love was a thing that arrived after the ceremony, like a piece of furniture one had ordered but not yet seen, and that she had waited for its delivery for 23 years. Each evening Edith listened. She did not write these things in her journal. They were not observations to be set down and examined, but offerings to be received and held. She kept them in the same part of her mind where she kept the sound of rain on the library windows and the color of the October sky, things that were true and particular and hers. By the 3rd week, Hugh began to ask for hers, not directly. He would mention something she had written, the entry about the way autumn light fell across the breakfast table, or the one about Collis's habit of clearing his throat before delivering any piece of news, as if each fact required its own small fanfare. And he would wait, and she would elaborate, and the elaboration would become a conversation, and the conversation would last longer than any conversation they had previously had, because it was built on a foundation of specificity rather than politeness. Mrs. Arden noticed first. She said nothing, because Mrs. Arden had been housekeeper at Ravelston for 14 years, and understood that the surest way to damage a new growth was to draw attention to it. But she began setting the tea tray with 2 cups instead of 1, and she began leaving the drawing-room fire built higher in the evenings, and she mentioned to the kitchen that her Grace seemed to be taking her meals with his Grace more frequently, and that this was not a thing to be discussed, but a thing to be accommodated. Collis noticed second, because the Duke began asking questions about the tenants that went beyond yields and rents, their children's names, their particular difficulties, the things they had mentioned to the Duchess during her morning calls that they would never have mentioned to him. Hugh had not previously known that Edith made morning calls. She had been doing it since the 4th month of their marriage, walking the 2 miles to the village and back 3 times a week, learning the names and circumstances of every family on the estate, because no one had told her she could not, and because the alternative was another morning in the silent house with only the rain for conversation. "You know them better than I do," Hugh said one evening. "I know them differently," Edith said. "They do not perform for me the way they perform for you. When the Duke arrives, they show him the things a Duke is expected to see. When I arrive, they show me the things that are actually there." "And what is actually there?" The Hatchett family needs the east cottage roof repaired before winter. Mrs. Colway's youngest has a cough that has not improved since Michaelmas, and she cannot afford the apothecary. And old Mr. Sefton's eyesight has failed enough that he can no longer read, and he sits by his window each afternoon, pretending to look at the newspaper, because he does not wish anyone to know. Hugh sent for the builder the following morning. He paid the apothecary's bill from the household accounts. He rode to Mr. Sefton's cottage himself and sat in the chair opposite the old man's window and read the newspaper aloud, the parliamentary reports first, which Mr. Sefton had always followed with the attention of a man who believed governance was everyone's business, and then the agricultural notices, and then, because the old man asked, the letter from Mr. Sefton's daughter in Shropshire, which had arrived 3 days earlier, and which he had been holding in his pocket, folded and refolded until the creases had worn soft, waiting for someone with eyes to read it to him. Hugh read it twice. The second time, Mr. Sefton did not pretend to look at the newspaper. When Hugh returned, his boots were muddy from the lane, and there was a quality to his silence that was different from the silence she had known, not closed, but full, the silence of a man carrying something he had not expected to find. Edith was in the library. She looked up from her book. He stood in the doorway with his riding gloves in one hand and said, "The rain sounds exactly as you described it," and sat down beside her. The journal continued. She wrote in it each morning at her desk in the sitting room, which faced the garden and received the early light that came over the east wall with the particular quality of light that exists only in the first hour after dawn, before the world has fully committed to the day. But the entries changed. Where once they had been the observations of a woman cataloging a world she moved through alone, they became the observations of a woman in conversation, still precise, still sharp, still occasionally ruthless in their accuracy, but directed now toward a man who would, she knew, read them eventually, because she had begun leaving the journal on the library windowsill where he could find it. The broken clasp was never repaired. Hugh never mentioned the entries he read. He did not need to. She could tell which ones he had found by the things he did the following day, the small adjustments, the questions he asked, the way he stood at the library window during rain and listened with the attention of a man who had been taught to hear. In the spring of their 3rd year, Edith gave birth to a daughter. They named her Frances after Hugh's mother, whose journal had been burned and whose observations had been lost and whose voice, Edith understood now, had been the voice Hugh had been listening for when he opened the honey-colored book on the library windowsill. Hugh held his daughter with the careful uncertainty of a man holding something he had not known he wanted. Edith watched from the bed, her hair damp against the pillow, her body exhausted, her mind still cataloging. The weight of the child in his arms, the way his hand covered the small dark head entirely, the expression on his face, which was not the composed expression she had known for 2 years, but something rawer and less finished, something that had not yet learned to perform itself. Mrs. Arden stood by the window, her hands folded, her face arranged in the expression of professional composure she had maintained through 14 years of service, but her eyes were bright, and when the child made a sound, not a cry, something softer, a note of inquiry directed at no one, Mrs. Arden turned toward the glass and pressed her knuckle against her mouth, and Edith loved her for it. "One thing," she said. He looked at her. "I am afraid," he said, "that I will hold her the way my father held me, at a distance, through glass." "You are already not holding her at a distance." "No," he said, and adjusted his grip, drawing the child closer against his chest. "No, I am not." The journal entry Edith wrote the following morning was the shortest she had ever composed, 2 sentences, set down in her best hand, the ink dark and certain on the page. "He is learning. So am I." She left it on the windowsill. The clasp remained broken. The cover was visible. At Ravelston, the rain fell against the library windows with its usual insistence, and in the drawing room, where it was quieter, a man who had inherited his father's silence sat reading his wife's words and occasionally, when no one was there to hear it, laughing. They arrive here, like a page left open where it might be found, whenever they are ready.